Welcome. In Chapter 2, we're going to start with looking at measures of center and spread. And you've seen many of these things ever since about 5th grade. They've hammered it into your brain, every single year since then, or about that often at least. So let's get started. Mean, the three M's are what we refer to as measures of center, so mean, median, and mode. And you probably know a lot about these things already, but the mean, again, just to iterate this or reiterate this is the same as an average. Okay, and mathematically, it's one center for the data. These are all different types of centers, but when we compute the mean, we use the symbol x bar, and all that means is it's the average of all the data values because we represent each of the data values, at least for quantitative data, with these little x's, and maybe we have, n of them, 10, 15, 500, doesn't matter, but we add them all up and then divide by however many we have. Okay, and this is actually, we're going to talk about this in the next video, but this is actually the sample mean. There's a sample mean and a population mean. We'll talk about the difference later. Okay. The median is a different center, and you might remember that there's this process where you got to line them all up in order and, take one off of each end until you get to the middle, and if there's two, you have to take the average of them. Yes, that is the median. All it is a midpoint, the midpoint of the distribution. Okay, so midpoint of the distribution. Okay, another way to think about the median is that 50% of the data is below, and then if you're glass half empty, if you're a glass half full type person, you might say above. Okay, so it's the middle point of the data that we have. All right. So, and then again, you can find this mathematically too, just by, like I said, putting them in order and ticking off one from each side until you get to the middle. And if there's an even number, take the average. Mode, this is simply the most frequent most frequent value in the data set, and you could have multiple modes. That's when we talk about whether our set is bimodal or unimodal, bimodal, and really we don't say trimodal or quadmodal, we just say multimodal if there's more than two modes, okay? But it would just be the most frequent value, okay? So these, again, are kind of easy peasy. You've seen those before. Measures of spread, you've maybe seen a few of these, and others you're like, what are they? Range, this is simply the value that we compute by taking the maximum value minus the minimum value. So it communicates how far spread out the data is from one end to the other end. Okay, that's the idea with range. The next two, standard deviation and variance, are connected. In fact, if we call standard deviation S, variance is just S squared. Okay, and again, I'm using particular notation here, which we'll clarify in the next video, but standard deviation, there's not a real good definition, and if you look if you Google it, all the definitions are kind of cyclical. Like they define standard deviation as the deviation from the mean. Well, you can't really use the term in the definition. So I think of this as the typical distance from the mean. Okay, and when we calculate this, if we were to do it by hand, what we actually end up doing is big scary symbol, it just means sum, and I'm going to do from I is equal to 1 to n, and what we end up adding together, that's all this means, is we take each observation minus the mean, and then square it, and then divide it by n minus 1 for s, and then technically, since this is a standard deviation, we have to square root it. Okay, so the bigger things here, don't worry about the calculation. We're not going to do it by hand. We're going to have Excel do it for us. But the idea is that with standard deviation and variance, you're looking at the difference in the observation from the mean and then squaring it, square rooting it, etc. And the n minus 1 is an average of sorts. So if you want to think about it as kind of like an average distance from the mean, that works as well. Okay, and the variance comes about because a lot of the times we don't like these square roots. Okay, so some people just like working square free. Okay, that's where we would do, but this would be the squared. typical distance. Okay, from the mean. Okay, mean. Okay. Um, all right, and I haven't talked about how to calculate these in Excel. We'll get there. Percentiles, okay? You might remember if you took a standardized test or whatever, you might say, oh, like it might tell you, oh, you scored in the 90th percentile, okay? So for example, if you got the 90th percentile, what that means is that you scored higher than 90%, oops, 90% of the testers, okay? And so, testers. Okay, so in general, if we say, okay, well, I'm looking at the nth percentile, that means that you scored higher than n% of the testers. So if you think about a point, n% would be under that point, okay? So percentiles. And a related concept is quartiles. And we typically talk about the first and third quartiles. We call the first quartile Q1 and the third quartile Q3. And as you might imagine, quartiles, quarters, 25. So we're thinking like multiples of quarters. So 25, 50, 75. So the first quartile Q1 quartile means that there's 25%. It's the same as the 25th percentile. So 25 percentile or 25% of the data is below that value. And similarly, Q3, that's the third quartile. And this is the same as the 75th percentile. So 75% of the data is under that value. Okay. Interquartile range, super huge concept that will come back into play in a few videos from now. But IQR, interquartile range, just means the distance between the third and the first quartile. So take Q3 minus Q1 as a value, see what you get. Okay. Another way you could think of it is it's sort of the middle 50%. Okay. But this is a number. Okay, so how do we use Excel? Okay, we'll get to an example here in a moment. In Excel, we can do the command equals average for mean, median, median, and then you have to do, select your data, and then same thing with median, select your data. Okay, mode. Well, you might guess it is mode. And actually, when you do this, there are going to be multiple different types of modes you can use. Just use the old mode, and Excel is going to whine at you saying, this is an old command. Totally fine. Range, this one, it isn't equals range. You actually have to do max of the data set and then minus the min of the data set. Okay. Standard deviation in Excel, there's two of them, stdev.s and .p, and then you would select the data for each one after. I'm going to tell you, we never, ever, ever use p because it refers to the population and we never have population data. More on that in the next video. Variance equals var.s, and again, there is a .p, but we're not going to use it. Okay, so var.s for variance. Percentiles. Okay, this is a point of contention between us and Sapling. There's going to be a percentile command in Excel, and then there's a .inc and a .exe for inclusive and exclusive. Okay, now we're going to default in this course for tests and whatnot, we're going to use percentile.inc. You might, if you're having trouble with Sapling, from what we understand, Sapling most of the time uses inc, but there are a few data sets where you might have to use exe. Okay, and then in here there are a few commands, so you have to select your data, and then you have to give the percentile. Okay, so you would for the quartile you would just do data and then percentile, or the like 0.25. Okay, you have to enter it as a percent. I should say percent. Okay, quartiles Again, I would just default to using percentile, just using 20, or 0.25 or 0.75 for the percent. And IQR, that's where you just have to do the calculation. Okay, so that's the overview. Stick with me for one more example. We are going to go hop into the Excel file that has the examples in it and look at 2.1. All right, so opening up the chapter 2 and 3 Excel file sheet, you can see the data here is talking about deaths by age and gender per 1,000 or per 100,000 people for motor vehicle occupants killed in crashes between 2012 and 2014. Okay, so this is quantitative data, and so if we wanted to find the average, say in 2012, so I'm just going to hide all this just for us to practice, and these other columns are here for you to use as you wish, just to get more practice. But if I wanted to find the average, I can do equals average, tab over, and then select the first cell and do Control Shift down to select all the data. And you can see I'm going to have to continue because there was a gap in the data. Okay, but nevertheless, I got the average is 8.5. You can do the same for equals median, and down, down, down. Oops, let's go back up. There we go. Okay, so I got the median. Just as an example with percentile, so the EXC is the first one that pops up. Let's use Inc. So the array that it mentions, that's your data. Okay, so select the data. And then after that, that's the percentile. So let's say I'm finding the 45th percentile. So I enter 0.45, and there we go. Okay. Now, so you can go through and compute average, median. Percentiles you'll always have to do by hand, but if you have that data analysis tool pack in there or installed, super handy tool that you can use called descriptive statistics in there. Okay. If you click into descriptive statistics, you say, okay, well, input range, that's your data. Okay, so I'm going to select the data. Alrighty. And then I'm going to go to output range, and it'll default to a new sheet, but I'm just going to select a place on the sheet that nothing is nearby, and then make sure to check summary statistics. And if I do that, you can see, okay, I have the mean, standard error. We'll get back to this later. That's not the standard deviation, it's different. Mean, mode, standard deviation, variance, kurtosis, which you don't need to worry about, gives you the range, maximum, minimum. It does not give you percentiles, so you still have to do that by hand. But either way, you can use the commands that I mentioned, or you can use the data analysis tool pack for many things except for the percentiles. All right, so make use of this data or this Excel sheet. Try, use or just try the data analysis tool pack and just those commands with other columns to get some more practice.